She wasn't the kind of woman men noticed when she walked into a room. And that was exactly how Nora Callahan had learned to survive. Not because she wasn't worth noticing, but because in the world she'd accidentally wandered into, being invisible was the closest thing to armor she'd ever found. Nora was 31 years old, 5'4", and what her mother diplomatically called generously built. Her hips were wide, her waist soft, her arms the kind that took up space without apology, though Nora herself apologized for them constantly, folding them in, tucking herself smaller, trying to occupy the exact footprint of a woman half her size. She wore dark colors, flat shoes. She kept her auburn hair in a low bun so tight it gave her headaches by noon. She'd been doing it so long she'd stopped noticing the headaches. She was the head accountant for Meridian Group, a holding company that, on paper, managed commercial real estate across 6 states. Off paper, and Nora had seen enough of what lived off paper to know better than to ask questions, Meridian was the clean face on something considerably less clean. The man who owned it was Ezra Callum, not her last name. Just a cruel coincidence she'd noticed on her first day and never mentioned to anyone. Ezra Callum was 42 years old, 6'2", and constructed like someone had sculpted him out of black granite and bad intentions. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes the color of deep water, the kind with no light at the bottom. He ran Meridian from the 43rd floor of a building he also owned, behind a desk that cost more than Nora's car, and he had never, in 14 months of her employment, said more than 12 words to her at a stretch. The quarterly report, make it clean, don't be late. That was essentially the full catalogue of their interactions. Nora told herself she preferred it that way. She told herself a lot of things. She was good at her job, extraordinary actually. Her mind worked in a way that most people's didn't, finding the logic buried inside numbers the way some people heard music in noise. She could look at a column of figures and feel instinctively where something was hiding. It had made her invaluable. It had also made her dangerous, which was perhaps why Ezra's head of security, a boulder of a man named Orson, watched her with the quiet attentiveness of someone who hadn't decided yet whether she was an asset or a threat. She kept her head down. She ran her numbers. She brought coffee no one asked her to bring, stayed late when the books needed balancing, and made herself so useful and so unobtrusive that she had essentially become part of the office furniture. She was fine with that. She was absolutely fine with that. The problem started, as most problems did, on a Thursday. Her friend Meg had been trying to get Nora out of the apartment for the better part of 3 months. Meg was a dental hygienist from Cincinnati, cheerfully relentless, the kind of person who used the phrase "you deserve good things" without a trace of irony. She'd signed Nora up for a dating app in February without telling her, set her profile photo to the one from her cousin's wedding, where Nora's hair was actually down, and had been fielding matches on her behalf ever since. "His name is Patrick," Meg announced over the phone on Tuesday. "He's a high school history teacher. He coaches junior varsity soccer. He has a golden retriever named Biscuit, and he thinks your photo is, quote, genuinely stunning." Meg, he used the word genuinely. "That's a man who means it. I don't have time." Thursday, 7 o'clock. "That new place on Clement Street, Harrow's. It's got tablecloths, Nora. Actual tablecloths." Nora had said yes, mostly to make the phone call end. She spent all of Wednesday regretting it, and all of Thursday talking herself into it, and by 6:30 she was standing in front of her bathroom mirror, in a dress she hadn't worn since her sister's birthday 2 years ago. A deep burgundy wrap dress that her mother had said made her look like a woman who knew what she wanted. At the time, Nora hadn't been sure that was a compliment. Looking at herself now, she thought, maybe the dress fit differently than she remembered, not smaller. She hadn't lost weight, wasn't trying to. It fit better somehow, like she'd grown into the authority of it. The burgundy was warm against her skin. Her hair was down for the first time in months, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. She'd put on the earrings her grandmother had left her, small garnets that caught the light. She didn't look invisible. She looked, she thought, almost exactly like herself, which was stranger and more unsettling than she'd expected. She went to the restaurant. Harrow's was the kind of place that understood the value of atmosphere. Dark wood paneling, low lighting that flattered everyone, white linen on every table, the kind of restaurant where people came to close deals, celebrate anniversaries, or conduct the sort of conversation that required a certain insulation from the outside world. Nora arrived 4 minutes early because she was constitutionally incapable of being late. The hostess, young, immaculate, professionally warm, led her to a corner table where Patrick was already waiting, and Nora felt some of the tension in her chest ease slightly. He was exactly what his photo suggested. Sandy-haired, open-faced, the kind of man who smiled easily and meant it. He stood when she arrived, which she hadn't expected, and said, "You look wonderful," with the uncomplicated sincerity of someone who wasn't running any particular angle. "Thank you," she said and sat down, and realized she was actually cautiously glad she'd come. They ordered wine. They talked. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. He told her about a student who'd recently discovered a passion for the Civil War and wouldn't stop emailing him reading recommendations. He laughed at his own story before he finished it. Nora caught herself laughing too, a real one, the kind that caught her off guard. She'd forgotten what this felt like, just sitting with someone, being seen. She excused herself to the restroom around the 40-minute mark, repinned one earring that had worked loose, looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. "You're doing fine," she told herself. She almost believed it. She didn't notice him when she came back to the table. That was the thing she would turn over later, in the small hours of the morning. She didn't notice him, and she always noticed everything. She was looking at Patrick, who had ordered another glass of wine, and was reading something on his phone with an expression of mild amusement. And she was already mentally composing the text she'd send Meg afterward. "Okay, fine, you were right. He's actually quite nice." When the temperature in the restaurant seemed to change. Not literally. The lights didn't flicker. No one gasped. But something shifted, some quality of attention in the room, the subtle gravitational rearrangement that happens when a certain kind of person enters a space. Nora looked up. Ezra Callum was standing at the host's podium 17 feet away, speaking with the hostess in a low voice. He was in a duck suit. No tie, collar open at the throat, the jacket the kind of cut that cost more than Nora made in a month. He had two men with him, wide-shouldered and quiet, who fanned out to either side of him with the practiced ease of people who did that automatically. Nora's first coherent thought was, of course he was here. Of course this was the kind of restaurant he frequented. Of course the universe had decided that the one night she came out, put on a dress, sat down across from a very nice man and started to feel like a person. Of course Ezra Callum would be 17 feet away. She picked up her wine glass. She focused very deliberately on Patrick. "Sorry," she said. "You were saying about the field trip?" She was good at maintaining composure. It was, alongside the accounting, her primary professional skill. Patrick was saying something about the bus arrangements for a trip to Gettysburg when she became aware, in the way one becomes aware of a storm building outside a window, that the quality of the air near their table had changed again. She looked up. Ezra was being seated. Not across the room, not at a discreet distance, but 4 tables away. Close enough that she could see the slight tension in the line of his jaw. Close enough that when he looked up, as she knew he would, because the universe was apparently committed to this particular comedy, he looked directly at her. The recognition moved across his face in stages. First the neutral scan of a man cataloging his environment, then a slight pause, then something she had never seen on Ezra Callum's face in 14 months of working for him. Stillness. Complete, absolute stillness. Like a man who had just heard a sound he couldn't identify and was waiting, very quietly, to hear it again. Nora looked away first. She was good at that too. He didn't say anything for 11 minutes. She knew because she was tracking it the way she tracked everything. Numbering the seconds, keeping a tally, the accountant's reflex of imposing order on chaos. Patrick was talking about Biscuit the Golden Retriever now, a story about a tennis ball and a swimming pool. And Nora was listening, genuinely listening, laughing at the right moments. And she was also with the other half of her attention, the quiet, watchful half that never fully turned off. She was also aware of exactly where Ezra Callum was sitting, and that he had not yet looked at his menu, and that his 2 companions were speaking and he was not responding to them. At minute 11, she heard a chair move. She kept her eyes on Patrick. "The thing about retrievers," Patrick was saying, "is that they have absolutely no concept of Nora." Patrick stopped. Nora took a breath that she hoped was invisible. Then she looked up. Ezra was standing at the edge of their table. Not looming. He wasn't the looming type, didn't need to be, but present in the way a building is present, a fact of the landscape, impossible to overlook. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression was the usual one, the polished granite of his professional face, except for something around his eyes that Nora couldn't name and would spend considerable time later trying to. Mr. Callum, she said. Her voice came out perfectly even. She was occasionally proud of herself. I didn't know you came here, he said. I wasn't aware I needed to report my dining choices. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a flinch, not quite amusement, something in between. Patrick cleared his throat. He was doing it with remarkable grace, all things considered. The sudden appearance of a man who looked like that at their table would have rattled most people. Friend of yours, he asked, with the careful neutrality of a man reading a situation he didn't fully understand. Colic, Nora said. Employer, Ezra said at the same moment. There was a small, not entirely comfortable silence. Patrick extended his hand across the table. Patrick Hale, nice to meet you. Ezra looked at the hand for a moment, not rudely, exactly, but with the slight delay of a man remembering that social conventions exist and apply to him, and then shook it. Callum, he said, nothing else. Well, Patrick said pleasantly. Enjoying your evening? Increasingly less so, Ezra said. Nora set down her wineglass with slightly more force than she intended. Was there something you needed, Mr. Callum? No, he said. Then I'll see you Monday. He didn't move for a moment. 2 full seconds, maybe 3, which felt considerably longer at the time. He was looking at her. Not at Patrick, not at the table, at her, with an expression she genuinely couldn't decode, which was unusual because she was very good at reading people, and had assumed, over 14 months, that she'd mapped the full range of what Ezra Callum's face was capable of. She had been wrong, he said. You look different. I'm not at the office, she said. No, he agreed, you're not. And then, without anything further, no apology, no pleasantry, no acknowledgement of the considerable awkwardness he'd just manufactured, he turned and went back to his table. Patrick watched him go. Then he looked at Nora with an expression of open curiosity that she found, suddenly, exhausting. Interesting guy, Patrick said. He's not interesting, Nora said. He's my boss and he has very poor boundaries and I'm sorry about that. Don't be. Patrick tilted his head. He looked at you like. He seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say and smiled instead. Never mind, more wine? Yes, Nora said. Please. The rest of the dinner was pleasant and she meant that. Patrick was genuinely good company. Thoughtful, funny, self-aware enough to know when he was being self-deprecating for effect and when he was being sincere. And the distinction mattered to Nora. She could see herself agreeing to a second date. She could see the uncomplicated shape of what that might look like. She was, against all odds, having a reasonable evening. What she could not do, and she was furious at herself for it, was stop being aware of the table 4 spots away, where Ezra Callum had ordered sparkling water instead of wine, and had spent the better part of the last hour in what appeared to be a running argument with his own thoughts. She knew because she could see him in her peripheral vision, and because she was, unfortunately, extremely observant, and because he kept doing this thing where he'd look at her, and then very deliberately look away, and then look back, and Nora had catalogued this happening no fewer than 7 times by the time dessert was declined and the check arrived. Patrick walked her out. It was a nice night, cool enough to feel like the city was exhaling, and they stood on the sidewalk outside Harrow's, and Nora thought, this is a normal thing, a nice man on a nice evening. This is what you came out for. I had a really good time, Patrick said, and he meant it. So did I, she said, and she also meant it, though she was aware of the footnote attached to that statement like a shadow. He said good night. She watched him walk down the block toward the parking structure, hands in his pockets, easy gait, the kind of man who moved through the world without calculating the angles. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cooling air and she thought, good, that's the right direction. She was reaching for her phone to call a car when the door behind her opened. She didn't turn around, she knew the footsteps. Nora missed Callum. She kept her eyes on her phone, pulling up the app. You're getting a car, remarkable deduction. I'll drive you. That's unnecessary, I know. A pause, I'll drive you anyway. She turned around. He was standing close. Not too close, but closer than the situation required, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd done in 14 months. The 2 men who'd arrived with him were hanging back near the entrance, with the studied inattentiveness of people paid to be invisible when required. Why? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. In the light from the restaurant window, warm and amber, the kind of light that doesn't let anyone hide very well, she could see something in his expression that she'd never been allowed to see before. Not softness, exactly. Nothing so comfortable as softness, but something underneath the granite, something that had been pressing against the surface for a while. You should have told me, he said. Told you what? That I was having dinner? That you were? He stopped, restarted. That you were seeing someone. I had a first date, Nora said, with a very nice man. That is not something I'm required to report to my employer. No, he said. You're right, it isn't. The agreement was somehow worse than an argument would have been. She stared at him. Then why are you standing on the sidewalk outside a restaurant at 9:15 on a Thursday night instead of going home? She asked. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from across the room. That same still, waiting quality, like a man who had heard the sound again and this time was going to let it land. Because, he said, I spent 40 minutes sitting 4 tables away from you watching some man with a golden retriever make you laugh, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard you laugh in the office, and I found that extremely difficult to sit with. Nora stood very still. You know my laugh, she said. I know everything about how you are in that building, Ezra said. I know you come in 40 minutes early on audit days. I know you eat lunch at your desk on Tuesdays and take the long way back from the coffee machine on Fridays because you go past the window that faces the park. I know you started wearing your hair up in March, and I know it's because Thompson from legal made a comment about it looking unprofessional, and I know you shouldn't have listened to him, and I should have said something at the time, and I didn't. The sidewalk was very quiet. You noticed Thompson's comment, Nora said. I notice everything about you, Ezra said. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself in 14 months, had trained herself specifically not to, because she had known somewhere in the very efficient back offices of her mind that if she looked at Ezra Callum without armor on, she would see exactly this. A man who noticed her, a man who had been paying attention in silence the same way she had, and that was terrifying for about 6 different reasons, several of which she could enumerate immediately, and at least 2 of which were directly related to the fact that he ran an organization that was, in the most generous possible characterization, adjacent to federal criminality. You run a criminal enterprise, she said. I run a very successful holding company, Ezra. He went still at his first name. She realized it was the first time she'd used it, out loud, directed at him. I keep your books, she said quietly. I know exactly what Meridian is. I've known since the 3rd week. Something shifted in his face. And you stayed. The work was interesting. A pause, and the salary is exceptional. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to it she'd seen on his face. A fractional softening of the line of his mouth that she was probably the only person in the world positioned to notice. It is, he agreed. You negotiated it well. I always negotiate well, I know. He took a step toward her, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back. Nora, I am not a man who makes things easy. I want you to understand that before. I work for you, she said. You could work somewhere else. That's not how it works. It could be. He was very close now. Not touching her, he wouldn't touch her without permission. She understood that about him with sudden certainty. A man who controlled everything would not take what hadn't been offered. If you decided it could be. Nora looked at him. She thought about Patrick, who was genuinely nice. She thought about Meg, who would have approximately 17 opinions about this conversation. She thought about the headaches from her too tight bun, and the long way around past the park window on Fridays, and the 14 months of careful invisibility. I went on a date tonight, she said, because I thought I should stop disappearing. You were never invisible, Ezra said. Not to me, not for a single day, she breathed. My terms, she said finally, whatever they are. I mean that. I am not rearranging myself to fit into the edges of your life. I don't fold myself small for anyone. I wouldn't want you to. His voice was different now, lower, stripped of its professional finish, something real underneath it. I don't want less of you, Nora. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that for months. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light. You're going to have to fire Thompson from legal, she said. He nodded without hesitation. Done. And you're going to stop sending Orson to watch me work. A pause. He's there for your protection. He's there because you can't walk up to my desk and talk to me like a normal person. Fire Thompson. Reassign Orson. And take me to dinner. A real one, not a corporate event. Name the restaurant. Somewhere without tablecloths, she said. I don't need the tablecloths. For the first time in 14 months of employment, and Nora was absolutely certain she was the only person who had witnessed this, Ezra Callum smiled. A real one. The kind that changed the whole geography of his face, that made him look briefly like a man who hadn't spent the last several decades being immovable. I know a place, he said. I assumed you knew every place. I do. He offered his arm, unhurried, undemanding, in the way of a man who was not accustomed to asking for things but was, perhaps, learning how. But this one I want to take you. Nora looked at his arm. She looked at him. Then she took her hair down the rest of the way. She'd done it halfway already, the bun half loosened in the restroom mirror, and she finished the job now, pulling out the last pin, letting it fall. She watched him watch her do it. She watched the stillness that came over his face. Good, she thought. Let him sit with that. She took his arm. Monday, she said as they walked toward the car. What about Monday? I'll still be your accountant on Monday. We need to be clear about that. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. The books would fall apart without you. They absolutely would, she agreed. The car was waiting, long and dark, at the curb. One of the silent men opened the door. Nora looked up at Ezra, at the silver in his hair catching the streetlight, at the expression he'd stopped trying to hide, and she thought, I am so much more trouble for him than he's ready for. She thought, good. She got in the car and he followed, and the city moved past the windows on all sides, lit and alive and indifferent. And Nora Callahan, who had spent 14 months being invisible, decided that she was finished with that particular strategy. She had always been worth noticing. She just hadn't needed anyone else's confirmation until now.